This is KM Weiland, and you're listening to the 278th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. And it's novel writing time. After spending last year outlining and researching my historical superhero story, Wayfarer, I finally get to start in on that first draft. For the last month, I've been frantically tying up loose ends on other projects and tap dancing on the inside whenever I thought about getting to immerse myself in a new fictional world. I took a week off earlier this month, which is something I like to do right before starting a new book. It kind of resets my mental focus and gets me geared up for the new project. This time it was a complete computer fast, which was great. My chiropractor is always telling me that sitting is the new smoking, so it was great to give my body a chance to work out some of its desk jockey kinks. But now it's back to the business of using that keyboard to spin magic out of nothing. The latest post in the video series on my blog is, are you leaving this crucial ingredient out of your book's first chapter? It shows how you can take a page from Captain America, the Winter Soldier, to hook readers with even a small amount of character development in your book's first chapter. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled The Lazy Author's Way to Identify and Overcome Writing Weaknesses. I have news for you. As a writer, you are failing. And that's fantastic. Okay, maybe not the failing part so much, but the fact that you know you're failing should have you breakdancing in the living room. Why? Because if you know your writing weaknesses, then you're halfway down the road to overcoming them. Nothing revolutionary there, of course. We all know that admitting you have a problem is the first step to success. What's tricky is going beyond just that vague sense that something's wrong to being able to actually figure out what your writing weaknesses are. But first, let me back up a step, because even though most writers are happy for the chance to overcome their writing weaknesses, that doesn't necessarily mean you're happy you have weaknesses. Our first reaction to our own less than perfect writing is often denial, followed by shame. Writing is a journey of never-ending learning that can leave even experienced writers gasping and overwhelmed in the face of their own inadequacies. But I'm here to tell you to stop your hyperventilating right now. As Verlyn Klinkenborg encourages in several short sentences about writing, whenever you get a glimpse of your ignorance, don't fear it or be embarrassed by it. Acknowledge it. What you don't know and why you don't know it is information too. So throw your triumphant arms in the air and shout it with me. I am not a perfect writer. Wahoo! And then let's get to work figuring out what your writing weaknesses are and how you can leverage them to become, if not a perfect writer, then a better writer. Sue Grafton says, if you know the question, you know the answer. The easy part of writing weaknesses is fixing them. The hard part is figuring them out to begin with. The best approach, as with so much of writing, is a combination of instinct and logical analysis. So let's consider 5 ways to identify your writing weaknesses. Number 1, pay attention to your gut feelings. A writer's instinct is a powerful, almost infallible thing. Our innate story sense will rarely steer us wrong. It knows when a story isn't working and it knows why it isn't working. The trick is learning to interpret what it's telling you. Whenever you have a nagging sense something's wrong with a story, listen to it. Now, I'm not talking about giving in to the snide whining of your infernal internal editor. Negative generalities such as this stinks or you're a horrible writer are not coming from your inner story sense. What you're looking for are specifics such as this POV is out of place, or the dialogue is stilted, or the beginning is weak. Sometimes these dictates will be about problems specific to just one story, rather than universal writing weaknesses found in all your stories. But the subconscious niggles telling you something's wrong are always worth pursuing. No one knows your strengths and weaknesses better than you. So tap into the source right from the start. 2, acknowledge what you dislike working on. Our writing weaknesses are usually the result of certain underdeveloped writing muscles. We've never gotten around to strengthening them for the same reason we've never used that treadmill we bought several Januaries ago. It's just too hard and unappealing. When trying to narrow down your subconscious nigglings to identify your faults, take a moment to consider the aspects of writing a story that you don't really like. Do you hate beginnings? In years past, I've shared many a podcast about how I found the first 50 pages torturous. Guess what? Beginnings were one of my writing weaknesses and still something I have to consciously focus on more than other aspects of the story. Are your antagonists one-dimensional? Do you summarize all your fight scenes? Do you avoid setting descriptions whenever possible? If so, then these aspects are very likely the result of some pretty emaciated writing muscles. 3, identify common weaknesses throughout your stories. Every story will present its own challenges, so something you struggle with in one story isn't necessarily a personal writing weakness. But when the same problem starts cropping up in multiple stories, you're probably looking at something that needs to be addressed on a larger scale. So consider the last several stories you've written. Write a list of all the things about them you're not quite satisfied with. Write a list of the aspects that were difficult for you in each story. Which part of each story did you spend the most time working on? When you're finished, analyze the lists. Are there any common elements from book to book? Chances are good that what you're left with are the weaknesses that belong to you as a writer and not just to any particular book. 4, ask critique partners and editors. We all know that objectivity about our own work is darn near unattainable. As important as your own story sense is, don't rely on it exclusively. Call in backup. Analyze the critiques you've received from beta readers, critique partners, and editors, especially those who have read more than one of your stories. Are you seeing any patterns? It can be difficult to be objective even about someone else's feedback on your story, so don't be afraid to ask them straight out. Their answers may surprise you and will certainly educate you. Again, you're looking for patterns. So when more than one person tells you your characters' motivations are weak, that's the time to listen up. 5, read your reviews. Writing weaknesses don't disappear just because you're published. Award winner Laurie Halse Anderson, author of dozens of YA and children's books, noted in an interview with Julie Krug, Boiling Down the Bones in The Writer, January 2015, "I know my weaknesses. Plot is still a challenge, but dialogue comes easily. Character development is cake, but I sweat blood about describing setting and folding descriptions into action to move the story along. I'm a terrible speller and a bit inventive with grammar, so I have to spend extra time on those too." If you are published, then you can find an extra dose of interesting insights into your writing weaknesses by paying attention to reader reviews. Granted, this can be shaky ground since readers bring their own extremely subjective opinions to the plate. But when you start seeing a common thread in negative reviews, that's when you know you should probably take a step back and consider where disgruntled readers are coming from. Alrighty, so now you know where you're coming up short as a writer. The bad news is, yes, you're coming up short. But the good news is that you now know what areas you need to be working on. So what do you do now? Consider a few do's and don'ts. Don't be ashamed of or embarrassed by your writing weaknesses. Don't run from or ignore your weaknesses. Don't try to write your way through the hard scenes as quickly as possible to get back to what you're good at. Do take James Scott Bell's advice in how to make a living as a writer and systematically study the craft of writing with special concentration on your weak areas. Do consciously approach your weak areas instead of just trying to wing it when the time comes. Do create a battle plan for attacking your weaknesses by sitting down with paper and pen and deliberately figuring out how to strengthen these areas in your next story. Identifying your writing weaknesses is, surprisingly, an incredibly exciting process. Instead of floundering around in the dark, knowing something is wrong, you can take control of your writing. And once you've conquered this batch of writing weaknesses, you get to repeat the whole energizing process all over again. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.